even though smaller platforms think they might not be affected by it, terrorist actors are really looking to exploit these smaller platforms because they usually know that they don't have as many tools to moderate the content effectively. So really looking out and being aware and taking the measures in advance is important for smaller platforms.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Tech Terror Takedown podcast, where we explore critical issues at the intersection of technology and public safety. I'm Sophia, Rothut researcher at LMU Munich and in the EU project TATE. I'm the host of this podcast, and today we're diving deep into the European regulation designed to address the dissemination of terrorist content online, known as the TCO Regulation. Joining us today to shed light on this important topic is Friederike Wegener from the European Commission. Friederike works in the Unit Prevention of Radicalisation within the Directorate General for Migration and Home Affairs. Her work focuses on preventing radicalization online through the misuse of the internet and new technologies by violent extremist and terrorist actors. Her important work also includes the monitoring of the implementation of the TCO regulation and supporting EU member states and hosting service providers in their efforts. Beyond legislative work, Friederike engages in voluntary cooperation with the tech industry via the EU Internet Forum, tackling issues such as crisis response, algorithmic amplification, and online financing activities. She also addresses crucial topics such as the radicalization of youth, hate speech, and anti-Semitism in relation to violent extremism. We're thrilled to have her on the show to help us understand the TCO regulation and its implications for tech platforms. Welcome to the podcast, Friederike. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Sophia. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
The European TCO regulation came into effect in June 2022. It is an approach to tackle terrorist content in a more international, EU-wide manner. What are the main obligations of tech platforms laid out in the TCO regulation?
Yeah, happy to dive into this. Actually, I'm also happy to say today, as we're recording, tomorrow will be the 2 years entering into application of the regulation. So I think this episode comes at a very timely moment. One little disclaimer before I begin. I have to clarify that any of my responses are given in the capacity of as staff of DG Home from the European Commission, to inform about the terrorist content online regulation, but they cannot be considered as formal responses or positions of the Commission, and therefore do not bind the Commission in any way, because we come into this later. It is the principal responsibility of the member states to implement the TCO regulation in a very complete and correct manner, and it's ultimately solely for the Court of Justice of the EU to interpret the TCO regulation. So, as a little disclaimer up front. But to your question, what are the main obligations laid out in the TCO regulation? So there are several obligations for tech platforms, but I will focus only on the key obligations here. And first I want to clarify actually who is covered. So the regulation speaks not about tech platforms, but about hosting service providers. And in order for a company to clarify or to be a hosting service provider and thereby be covered by the regulation, they have to fulfill 3 cumulative criteria. And firstly, this is that they store the content at the direct request of the content provider. Secondly, that they disseminate the content to the public. That means to a potentially unlimited number of persons. And then thirdly, that they offer the services in the union. So this also means that any platform, no matter where it is located, if it offers the services in the union, they have to comply with the TCO regulation. What I think is interesting here is that to be an HSP, that means it can also be just a service of a platform, and other services of a platform might be excluded. So to make it more concrete, as an example, if you share something on your general Facebook feed, this is covered by the TCO regulation because you upload it and it's disseminated to the public, and then the services offered in the union. But if you share it, for example, in a closed group on Facebook where there's a human moderator that needs to have you accept to the group, that is very likely not covered by the regulation because it's not disseminated to the public. So important to understand that an HSP can be a service of a tech platform doesn't mean it's the whole service. But now actually coming really to the question, to the main obligations, what are they? So the first and the very big core of the regulation is the 1-hour rule. And that means that companies are required to remove terrorist content from their platform or disable access to that content in the EU within 1 hour after receiving a removal order from a national competent authority. And the hosting service provider, I will say from now on HSP because that's a little bit shorter, the HSP also have to give feedback to the issuing authority and inform if they complied with the order or not. Secondly, the second big important aspect of the regulation is that if companies are exposed to terrorist content, they can also be obliged by the national competent authority to take specific measures. And that means that the company has to be more proactive to detect the exploitation of its platform and to report about it to the national competent authority. And then thirdly, it also means that the company, when it takes down content, it has to preserve the content for 6 months. And this is really important for 2 reasons. Firstly, because it allows law enforcement to access the content later on in case it's needed for investigations. And also it ensures the protection of fundamental rights. So if there is content that has been removed unduly, it can be reinstated later if the company ensured that it is preserved for 6 months. And safeguarding the fundamental rights, such as freedom of expression, is really important as part of the TCO regulation. So we have very clear obligations here also for companies that the user rights are protected. So this means, for example, there are transparency obligations. Every HSPs has to explain in their terms of conditions how they address the dissemination of terrorist content online. And they have to publish a yearly transparency report where they inform about all the actions that they have been taken. And this report has to be made public on the 1st of March every year, and this is accessible to the public overall. And then staying with the protection of fundamental rights, there's a 5th and a 6th obligation for HSPs. And that is that they have to establish mechanisms for users to complain if they disagree with the fact that their content has been removed. And the HSP also has to inform the user if they remove the content as part of a removal order. So really to ensure that users are informed and can complain for the content potentially to be reinstated if they disagree. And then the last 2 obligations are that in order for all of this to work, the hosting service provider has to establish a contact point to receive the removal orders, and they have to establish a legal representative in the EU so that the national competent authorities can get in touch with the HSP and follow up also in case of non-compliance. So that's the key obligations that the HSPs have.
Certainly, it might not always be easy to fulfill those requirements, and I imagine the 1-hour removal rule can be quite tough. What can happen if a hosting service provider cannot comply with the TCO regulation?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think we can look at this from 2 sides. For example, if the platform or the HSP cannot comply with the removal order because the removal order contains manifest errors, or for example, it doesn't contain sufficient information like the correct URL, in that case, the HSP has to inform the issuing authority immediately that it cannot follow up on the removal order. But non-compliance in individual cases, for example, because the HSP doesn't want to follow, can also be subject to penalties. But here it's important to say that the member states need to ensure that the penalties are proportionate to the non-compliance. And penalties can take very different forms. So it can include formal warnings from the issuing competent authority in case of minor infringement, to financial penalties in relation to more severe or really systematic infringements when we see or when the competent authority sees that a platform never really complies. Member states are also obliged to publish the potential penalties that they can impose in the national legislation. So every HSP can basically have a look what happens if they don't comply. But I think it's really important here, as we also make sure that no company is hit harder with the TCO regulations, so especially smaller companies and smaller HSPs. So it's important to keep in mind that the regulation clarifies that the size of the HSP needs to be taken into account. So, for example, if the HSP is a startup or micro or medium or small sized enterprise, the issuing competent authority needs to take this into account when setting the penalty. So that, for example, for financial penalties, this should be smaller than for a big multinational company.
So basically, everything is centered around the term terrorist content. For clarity, or more of a basic question, what exactly is to be understood as terrorist content?
Yeah, thanks. It sounds like a very straightforward question, but I think especially those people that have dealt with defining and identifying terrorist content knows it's not always that easy. We can take this question from the type or the format of the content and then actually the content. So if looking at the format, it can really have a lot of different forms and format. Terrorist content can be text-based, like a manifesto, or it can be a video or an image. For example, the videos that we saw circulating after the terrible Christchurch attack in 2019. We can also see terrorist content that's generated by artificial intelligence. We see this more and more at the moment, actually. But terrorist content can also be in audio format, such as nasheed, which are produced by terrorist organizations, which glorify terrorism or incite terrorist attacks. So this is the formats and the forms that we see. Also key when looking at the definition of terrorist content is that content which is disseminated for educational, journalistic, artistic, and research purposes is excluded from the scope of the regulation to protect fundamental rights, notably freedom of expression and freedom of information. But, and I think this is very interesting to see, terrorists are always developing their tactics, and we do see a whole new online threat landscape not only a couple of months, but on a very dynamic way. And what we saw after the terrible terrorist attacks by Hamas on the 7th of October is that a lot of citizens and journalists actually shared terrorist content on social media platforms. And while this content is protected under the regulation and therefore could not be removed, I think it's important that if we want to prevent terrorist content from circulating online, it's really a multi-stakeholder effort, and it takes the efforts from everyone. So as a journalist or as a citizen, if I want to raise awareness, that is important. But I think we all need to be aware that we don't share terrorist content when doing so, because it can still have negative effects on victims or still lead to radicalization. But coming back to the content of what is terrorist content, if you look into the regulation on Article 2, there we have examples of what material is defined as terrorist content. And that includes incitement or glorification of terrorist acts. Also, if someone solicits to participate in activities of a terrorist group or to commit a terrorist offense, this is considered terrorist content. Likewise, if someone provides instructions of how to use or build weapons, that can be explosives, firearms, or CBRN weapons, to commit a terrorist attack, that can be considered as terrorist content. But the regulation also gives a little bit of additional information of how to assess if something is terrorist content. For example, if you look at recital 11, so the text that is at the beginning of the regulation. Here, the guidance, for example, includes that companies or member states' national competent authorities should take into account factors such as the nature and the wording of the statement, or the context in which that statement has been made, and what the potential of it is to lead to potential harmful consequences. And then another last big guiding factor, for example, is that if the material is produced by or is attributable to or is disseminated on behalf of a person, a group, or an entity included in the EU terrorism list or along the Union list of persons, groups, and entities involved in terrorist acts and subject to restrictive measures, which is a public list, in that case, that can also be a very clear indication that this content is terrorist content.
There might be cases in which hosting service providers disagree with the competent authority's assessment of a piece of content as terrorist. What can a hosting service provider do if it disagrees with that assessment?
Yeah, so I think first of all, it's important to understand that if an HSP receives a removal order, they need to comply with it, no matter if they agree or disagree. So that means when they receive it, they have to remove the content or block access to it in the European Union. But as I mentioned, there are really clear safeguards on fundamental rights. So if the HSP disagrees, it has the right to challenge the removal order and its assessment in front of a court. And this is the way it can take.
The TCO regulation mentions so-called specific measures that a hosting service provider has to take under certain circumstances. What does this mean specifically, and when does that apply?
Yeah, so we do see indeed that most companies already prevent terrorist activity on their platforms and have very strong terms of services and use tools and human moderators to moderate illegal content in one way or another. But that is not necessarily always sufficient. And we also have, so to say, non-cooperative platforms that don't do this very much or not at all. So what it means to apply specific measures, that is, if an HSP is designated by its national competent authority, and that means by the national competent authority where the HSP has its legal representative, then the HSP has to apply specific measures. And this designation needs to be based on objective factors. So, for example, if the HSP has received two or more removal orders in 12 months, then the National Competent Authority can designate the HSP and it has to inform about it. So that doesn't happen out of the blue, but there is a whole process behind it. The regulation doesn't really define what are specific measures and what they look like, because it here leaves really the room and the flexibility for the HSP itself to choose what's most appropriate for its service and for its challenges. When we spoke about terrorist content, I mentioned that terrorist content can take different formats. So some platforms are more audio-based, others are more text-based, others are more video-based. So here, each platform really can choose what is most appropriate for its service. But the regulation proposes certain measures, such as appropriate technical or operational measures, easier mechanisms for users to flag the content, or other ways how to improve their content moderation efforts. Of course, the HSP has some obligations here as well, but these are really, so to say, easy. They mean that they have to ensure that the measures they take are proportionate to fundamental rights, so that they don't just block any content. The HSP can decide to use technical means, such as artificial intelligence. There's no obligation to do that. They can use it. If they do, here the regulation is quite clear, the HSP needs to ensure that they have effective safeguards by human oversight and verification, so as to ensure that there's no AI system deciding alone on what content goes up or what doesn't. And as I mentioned, yes, there's no obligation to use these automated tools. One more obligation for companies here, I mentioned at the beginning already, if the companies are designated as exposed to terrorist content and have to take specific measures, they need to report regularly about the measures that they have taken to the National Competent Authority and also inform the users by the terms of services and in the transparency reports. So really a lot of transparency so everyone knows what's happening. If, as you asked before, what happens if HSPs disagree, they can also disagree here with being designated as exposed to terrorist content. And in that case, they can request a review of this decision at any time. Also, they say, hey, we have really improved our content moderation. There's no more terrorist content on our platform. They can ask the competent authority to review the decision.
What hurdles do small platforms face when implementing the TCO regulation, and more specifically, what tips can you give small HSPs on how to deal with the 1-hour removal rule and how to meet the requirements of the TCO regulation in more general?
So, with regard to the 1-hour rule, I would like to clarify one very important point, and that is that if the HSPs or when the HSP receive the removal order, they have not to assess the content themselves. So this is already done by the specialized national authority. So the HSP only has to ensure that the content is removed or the access blocked. The HSP can also decide in which language it accepts to receive the removal orders. So that means the HSP doesn't have to understand all 24 languages of the EU, but it can say it only wants to receive the removal order, for example, in German. Having said that, we know that small HSPs usually have less human, financial, and technical capacity and capability compared to larger platforms. So many lack the tools and processes to effectively implement their regulation, and the obligations can translate into a greater cost for them. And even though they don't have to assess the content and only take down the content within 1 hour, that can be difficult for companies that don't have 24/7 hour support teams. So other issues that we also see is that smaller platforms are not necessarily aware of the regulation, or they believe they're at lower risk. And that's, I think, also important to understand here as a tip, that even though smaller platforms think they might not be affected by it, terrorist actors are really looking to exploit these smaller platforms because they usually know that they don't have as many tools to moderate the content effectively. So really looking out and being aware and taking the measures in advance is important for smaller platforms. So because we are aware that this can be a challenge for smaller platforms to take down the content or to block the access within 1 hour, we are really supporting them via different means. First of all, looking at the regulation, before the first removal order is sent, or when the first removal order is sent to a platform, there's a warning period. So the first removal order does not have to be implemented within an hour, but there's 12 hours for the platform to react. So this is a little bit of a test and trial period, so to say. But then afterwards, the HSPs have to react within 1 hour. And what we're doing in the European Commission here is within the EU Internet Forum. This is a public-private partnership that we have. We really help smaller platforms with their content moderation efforts. And we also funded 3 projects, among them TATE, of which you listen to the podcast right now, to help the small platforms to overcome the hurdles. And Sophia, I know you can go into much more detail here, but these projects really provide trainings and tools and also templates to really help the small HSPs to comply with the regulation. So I would really recommend all smaller HSP listeners that are here to check out the platforms, so TATE, Friska and Allies, to see the different support activities and tools they offer to comply with the 1 hour rule and all the other applications that I mentioned at the very beginning.
It's great that there is much support and information out there. You mentioned the 3 projects, TATE, Allies, Frisco, that offer support and learning resources for HSPs, small HSPs specifically. Do you have recommendations on where anyone interested in the TCO regulation can find out more about it?
Of course. So aside TATE, Friska and Allies, the 3 projects that I would really recommend all listeners to check out, I can recommend to go to the DG Home website from the European Commission. And here we host a lot more information on the regulation and its obligations, a fact sheet, for example, and a lot more content of also context of why we needed the regulation. Very interesting also is the implementation report. It sounds very dry, it sounds very bureaucratic, but on the 14th of February this year, the Commission published this implementation report on the TCO regulation. And it's a really concise report that gives an interesting overview on the use of removal orders in the first year of application, and also in particular in the response to the online dimension following the 7th of October terrorist attack by Hamas, and also which kind of HSPs received removal orders. So it's a very, very interesting read, I think, for everyone. Also, on the DG Home website, we have the online register. This lists all the national competent authorities and their contact points that are designated by the member states. And I would recommend all HSPs, small and not small, to have a look at this register and to get in touch with their respective national competent authority. Some of those actually organize additional events and provide supports for small HSPs. So it's really helpful to be proactive, reach out to the national competent authorities and have a conversation with them to be able to implement the regulation effectively and not be surprised by anything that relates to it. Also, the German competent authority published a whole study with good practice examples of established community standards or recommendations for the size of content moderation teams, as well as current and upcoming technical measures for content moderation. So the study really promotes reasonable specific measures fitted to the size of each HSPs and proposes some minimum standards. So that's, I think, great guidance. And maybe we can share the link to the online register and the study in the show notes if that's possible. And then one last tip, the EU Internet Referral Unit, in short, the EU IAU at Europol, is also open to work with HSPs to help them address the dissemination of terrorist content on their platform and to help them implement the regulation. So I would also recommend everyone to get in touch with the colleagues here if they want to, because this is really helpful for everyone. I hope this is helpful. That's a lot of the additional material that is out there.
That sounds indeed very helpful. Thank you so much, Friederike, for sharing your valuable expertise with us today. I think it became very clear that the TCO regulation plays a crucial role in ensuring a safer online environment by tackling terrorist content more efficiently across the European Union. Your insights have certainly helped clarify how tech platforms, HSPs, especially smaller ones, can navigate these regulations and fulfill their responsibilities. To our listeners, we hope you found this episode as informative and useful as I did. If you have any questions or want to learn more about the TCO regulation, be sure to check out the resources mentioned by Friederike. You can find links to them in the show notes. Thank you for listening and stay tuned for more to come. Stay safe and goodbye.